Good evening and welcome. And thanks to all of you for being here this evening for this Sunday at the Abbey presentation. I'd just like to briefly introduce Father Jerome. He came to St. John's from the prairie and small towns of northeastern North Dakota. Great state, great part of the state, huh? His initial connection to art came from courses that he took as a high school student. Here in Collegeville, he also took additional courses and studied French for his undergraduate degree. Later, he did a master's degree in French and then a doctorate. And it seemed at that time as if French was his vocation. I'm sure you see this in your sons and daughters. What's the vocation and what's the avocation, huh? And sometimes they flip. Huh? Sometimes they flip. Jerome made his first profession here at Collegeville as a monk of this monastery. March 21, we're coming up on it this coming Saturday. In 1964, just before the major changes in the structure of the community occurred. So he joined the community as a brother monk, which really the brother community lived as a kind of separate community within the larger monastery. And that's the way it was until 1967 when all the changes occurred. It was only in the 70s, after he had completed his doctorate, that Jerome studied for ordination to the priesthood. Jerome taught French and lived as a faculty resident in the dorms with students for many years. He founded the Study Abroad program in Caen, France, and he directed students in that program, semester at a time, 8 times, if you can imagine. Huh? And later he also took study groups to Rome and the Middle East in January and then later on the May terms. Whenever he did that, obviously working with students to come to a deeper understanding of their own spiritual journey and their own call. And particularly when he was in major centers where art was present, he was helping them to try to understand the relationship between art and spirituality. It was while he was studying for his doctoral work, being in the presence of the great artistic tradition within Paris, France itself, and all the museums, that in fact his own artistic passion was again stirred. When I think of Jerome's art, and I will not do a grocery list here, when I think of Jerome's art, I think of love of color, I think bold, I think big paintings. I think of playing with form. I think of prolific and a connection to the holy and the search for God. And for those of you who are here from St. Joe and are in the parish at St. Joe or from St. John the Baptist, you'll know that Jerome, is always thinking about these artistic forms and beauty as he's thinking about ministry and preaching the word and trying to share faith with you. I would have to say that one disappointment I have is that his love and appreciation for chemistry seems underdeveloped. The title of this presentation this evening is The Path of a Monk, the Path of an Artist. Please give Jerome a warm collegial welcome.
Thank you, and welcome to all of you. Nice to see this large turnout. Thank you. Well, everything technically tends to be a bit off when I'm around for some reason. It's kind of like my closet. I have a very strange closet. I was going to wear my habit this evening, and then I found out that in that closet, things shrink. And it really put me off wearing that habit because I wouldn't have gotten it closed, probably. Anyway, this evening I am going to speak about the changing periods and series that I have done in art. I want to just preface this with the fact that the colors you're going to see are very different than the reality, because between this part of the computer and the projector must have been a distance where it goes to Paris first and then comes back. And so everything is really whitened out. There are no nuances. As the abbot was saying, many of our study abroad programs were important in my evolution as a painter. Beginning here in this first piece, this is a piece from Aix-en-Provence, where we had a program for probably about 4 years. And I had a beautiful apartment in the cathedral complex. And every day I would go out running. I was a runner in those days. And I would go out towards, as you can see, Mont Saint-Victoire, this famous icon, which was painted so often by whoever his name was. And you're all familiar with who it is. Who is it? Cézanne, of course. And since I'm going to be calling on the audience regularly for help, this will be, that way we can say that it's a dialogue. So the view was the interior part. This was my apartment with very large French windows. And the running that I had done, of course, was through these beautiful woods up into the hills surrounding Aix-en-Provence. That period of painting, I really produced quite a number of pieces at that time, and these came in about the year 1980, and it changed because I was finished painting simply scenes, decorative scenes, and I went into then a period. This was painted in Rome. I had a wonderful studio in a tower of Sant Anselmo, the Benedictine mother house or center for studies. And while I was there, I became fascinated with the walls of Rome and the textures. So I did a series of pieces that worked with those colors. This painting is entitled A Cavalier and His Lady. And the horse that you can see was carrying the cavalier, and you can see that he has his arm around his lady as he is courting her. This becomes one of the central pieces of a spiritual growth, because I was trying to find out how to paint spiritual images that were different from what we were familiar with. That would be works from the Renaissance or from tacky religious paintings coming from the 19th century or even 20th century. And so here you have a circular piece. You can see that with the arm, the head of the horse, and then the rear end of the horse all of that makes a circular form. When I think of this is not supposed to be there anyway yet. This is, that circle was intentional, and you'll see it throughout whatever I do. It is the idea, if you take a form, how would you portray God? And so we have many images for God in form. One would be circular, that would be eternity, unending, continuation. And the other is color, in which you see such a, there has to be a lot of passion. And so that's why there is a brilliance in the colors. This piece was shown in Paris at UNESCO. This was the year of the Holy of the Family from the Vatican, and so the Holy See was the sponsor for a show with the family. And here is portraying, to me, what is the essence of family, and that is this embrace through a circle. Abbot Jerome was amazing in that when he saw the piece, he was speaking, he talked about the perichoresis, that to understand the Trinity, we have to think of the Trinity in the form of a dance, and in that interrelationship of Father, Son, and Spirit, all moving in equal harmony. And so that was what this relationship and what this exhibition was about. You can see in this one a Holy Family at play, and she has a violin. Unfortunately, the bow is slightly bowed, and so it doesn't look like all of the static lines, perhaps, of what you would expect with a violin. However, you see also the tremendous envelopment of the male. This was pre-feminist period, remember, so nobody speaks up about this issue, please. It's very hurtful. So you can see that the man, as should be, is really enveloping the woman. And to me, this is perhaps essence of love. And when you come to abstracting the ideas that I was just speaking about, here you have an icon abstracted. For many years, I studied iconography. And so at the top of the piece, you can see where perhaps there would have been the history of a saint, as in traditional iconography. And below, you have a place where the perhaps saint or the of Christ might be seated. But here we're speaking about God in different terms. We're speaking about God as enveloping all things, as a universal, as a continuum going through this this circular piece. However, it is seated upon a breast. So you have a male figure on top being supported by the breast that is kind of the mother of all inspiration. A portrayal of perhaps God as a fiery passion, God as a male and female figure supporting each other, depending upon each other. This was a series that of many pieces that were shown at the Minnesota Museum of Art in St. Paul back in the 80s. A different series that was created, abstracted again, goes to the concept again of God with this Trinity as the form of a triangle. And within the triangle you have a shrine. And the shrine is this little piece in the very center where you see very much I have it on, but we can't use it because it makes noise.
Do you have a laser pointer?
Oh, that's technology.
Oh, we got one for you.
Okay. So with that, you can see that this is, in one sense, it's like a stained glass window, but yet it is also the very rays coming from that center. What I was finding in the 80s, 70s was that people were searching, and they're searching for a shrine. They're searching for a place where they can sense that God is, in a way, more present. And so this concept of shrines and pilgrimages is at the center of this series of paintings. In the late 90s, I skip over the 90s at this point, but perhaps I will come back to it. This is a series of the California missions that I was commissioned to paint, and so I went around to 21 different missions and did sketches and watercolors of each, and then came back to my studio and painted. As you can see, on the far left would be San Diego, St. John the Baptist up on the top, and the shrine from Dolores, Our Lady of Sorrows in San Francisco. Again, you notice the circular pattern, trying to make this, each of the pieces, okay, each of the pieces as, again, a circular piece, so that it's, in the one sense, not static, but in the other sense, using these towers to move your eye around the space of the canvas. These are somewhat large paintings. This one probably is close to the size of the screen. This part of the screen. The others are much smaller, maybe that much off. Most people in their living rooms have difficulty placing these, but I say that's a lack of foresight on the part of the families. So when you have the California missions that were commissioned, well, I thought that was such a good gig that I then convinced them that a series of paintings from Paris to Compostela in Spain would also be a marvelous idea. And they were suckers, and they took it in, and it was wonderful. That this is the city of Nevers in central France, And I wish you could see the true colors of this, but they have one of the most beautiful cathedrals, I think, in the sense of stained glass. They have had wonderful artists come in and work with stained glass because it was blown out at one time, probably in the war. And so they needed all new, or much of it new. And so they took the old, probably 15th century stained glass and added contemporary pieces to each of them. And it was absolute splendor. It's something that, it's very seldom I'll go into a church twice. But this one I kept going back in because I do a lot of the exterior work while I'm painting on the road, and so the interiors of these pieces will be visited, but usually we'll get at most a sketch. So Nevers. And what is important here is this road for the pilgrims. The Pilgrim Road begins for one path in Paris, another one at Le Puy in central France, and another one would be Vézelay, which is in Burgundy. And these beginnings of the road to Compostela are all filled these days with pilgrims. Brother Andrew and I were on this particular trek through France, and we were amazed at the number of people that were going from one center to the other, walking towards Compostela. This particular place is a shrine for the little girl who saw Mary, or where Mary appeared to her in Lourdes, Bernadette. And so in this little town was where her convent was and where she is interred. Lots of pilgrim visitors that come to pray at her tomb. Wrong. Here is another of the French component. This is a little town called Estaing. And in that town you have a wonderful little castle. There's a very small chapel which was enlarged, and the chapel actually is in here, but for balance, since we need something with balancing the castle, I moved it over here and then gave it a nice plaza, and there is no plaza there. But on the other side of this chapel is a great restaurant. And so that figured in importantly in that particular visit. I spent much less time on my knees, but anyway, this little town is marvelous. And again, you can see the bridge that goes across this river, and the pilgrims really stack into this place at night because there are a number of hostels receiving them. The road to Rome. This was a pilgrimage, really, made out by myself pretty much, with Francisco Schulte as my assistant guide. And so I went through Italy drawing and doing watercolors and then translating that into oils. And the show must have had 24, 25 large oils and a few of the watercolors. Again, it's sad that the watercolors just have not the correct colors at all. But you get the idea of what it is. So drawing in a place like Lucca, the problem is oftentimes you have these wonderful towers, and to fit them in on a paper, you really need to figure out some way to get them around. And so it does create that nicer movement. Here you have a center of Cortona, and in that center, I was up on a rooftop. The people in the hotel were very, very nice because they saw that I was going out and drawing every day. And so they said, well, you know, you might get a really nice view from up on our roof. And nobody was allowed up there. And then I found out why, because the pigeons actually live up there. But I did take the time and stood out there and worked on some of these pieces that seem to come together almost as a deconstruction of the actual plaza. And down here is the preparation for a painting from Siena. And in Siena, you have one of the great places is this Church of St. Dominic, where you have the head of St. Catherine of Siena. Again, as a shrine and a holy place, many people come there to visit and to pray. And St. Catherine is so interesting because you can actually see the skull. And for some really deep reason, the Italians love showing the bones of saints out in public. And so the story is that not only did they show it in public now, but that the mother of St. Catherine went to Rome to pick up the remains, and in procession, then they carried the head all the way from Rome to its place in Siena, where it belongs. The body, unfortunately, remains elsewhere and is very much enjoyed by a church in Rome, where you can see the remaining part of this decapitated poor lady. But then that's what she tried to do to the church. She was a wonderful writer, and apparently was very influential with the popes living at Avignon at the time, and bringing the papacy back to Rome. She would mince no words, you know. Dear Holy Father, get back to Rome. It's about like that, you know. Mine was a little more dramatic, but then. Another part of Italy, of course, is this monument of St. Mark's in Venice. It is a thieves' den, Venice. Unfortunately, we have maybe somebody here. I haven't seen him yet, but he may be here. Anyway, this city is, as we see it today, is based upon the thievery of the Venetians as they plundered Constantinople and many of the places in the Middle East. And so in tribute, I put in this Persian rug. They might as well steal that as well. But on top, those wonderful horses that were there, they are from Constantinople, as are the piles of relics that they took from various places, Antioch, etc., where the Crusaders had gone to, well, they were supposed to be going to get rid of the Muslims in the Holy Land. But there were such juicy pickings along the way that they decided that they probably had enough loot. And so after weakening the Byzantine Empire, they came back and gilded their residences and this church. I should say something nice about the Venetians. But I won't. So we're going off to another place of shrines, and I wanted to show this particular watercolor because this is on the island of Patmos, where John the Evangelist wrote his Revelations. And it's a real, if I were living in a place that is kind of deconstructed like that, I probably would have visions of my own. But John, his fortress, as you can see here, is really quite a stunning piece of medieval work. And the watercolor that I did shows this door and basically the structures that are around this. All of this, again, as you can see, creating a circular pattern. Patmos is one of the holy areas for the Greek Orthodox. So this place is greatly visited, even though it is on an island, which is somewhat difficult to get to. Here is a recent painting of that same fortress with the Holy Door in it. While being a director of the program in Cannes, I did a lot of painting with gouache, watercolor drawings, and even some oil, because I was there often and I could store things. But here is one called Rushes. And Cannes is absolutely a beautiful place, but they do have what you would call cane. And so I wanted to do something that kind of was a tribute to that plus the sun. And this series of works probably covers 50 to 75 of these pieces. Recently, I have been going to the Middle East, and I've done that actually for a number of years. And where you would start your pilgrimage really would be either in Venice, since much of the treasure is there from the Middle East, or, I'm sorry, my confrere is actually from the Veneto region, and so he's a nice man. So, here we have Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Hagia Sophia is one of the most amazing churches, I believe, ever built. To think that it was made in the 600s, and it continues to withstand earthquakes, storms, and various revolutions, and is a monument to the architecture of the Roman period. This is one of my renditions from it. You see, when you sit in the middle of a park painting with the sun out and with people strolling, I begin already, let's say, working on what the ultimate pattern might be for a painting. And when I then go to the studio, the painting it really relates very easily from the sketches that I've made and then translates into an oil. Here you have that great piece of work, Hagia Sophia. And even though I have no sense of chemistry, I think that the architecture and the structural physics involved in creating this really outweighs what one would know or care about with chemistry. So I am totally inspired by these ancient monuments and how they were built, how in a time that we would consider the, what would we call it, a dark period or an unlearned period. You can see from this structure that the knowledge that it would take to do this exceeds what we were able to do probably until St. Peter's or the Dome of Florence Cathedral. We were unable for probably 1,400 years. Does that add up? No. Anyway, that's why I don't understand chemistry either, you know. Things just don't add up. This is my time. You don't speak. Yeah. So here's another piece from Hagia Sophia. Putting it on in a circular. I had never done a really circular painting before, and so one of the things that I've always enjoyed with painting is that when you find some new thing, there are also new concepts that come along. That could be finding a paint that is more transparent, for example, and that can be used to wash over more transparent, opaque pieces. Finding new colors also is something that I have found changes what I am trying to do in painting. Right next to Hagia Sophia is the oldest church in Constantinople, a church that was, this is St. Irene, and this actually is Holy Peace is the name of this. Built in the very earliest days of Constantinople, perhaps in the 400s. And so this was the main church for the emperor and the courtiers. This is all in the courtyard or the grounds of what is called today the Topkapi Palace, which was where the emperors during the Byzantine Empire, that's where they lived, and then they would process over for special holidays or other events over to Hagia Sophia, which is very close. When you have a church really this size, as you can see, it's Roman architecture. This is not worthy of an emperor of the Byzantine Empire. So that's why Hagia Sophia becomes the acting church. It's also because the patriarch of Constantinople was an equal figure, really, with the, no, well, not an equal. He was an important figure in the court of the emperor. shrines. This one is from Istanbul, called Yeni Cami, and it's really patterned after the Blue Mosque, and the mosques, as you can see, are patterned after Hagia Sophia. But as a religious shrine, these are very, very important to the Turkish people. This painting is a problem painting in that you can see that so much of this is linear, and without the height to create something for, this is a relatively small painting. It's not even as large as this, as you see it. And there was no room for these, what do you call them? Minarets. So it becomes a linear piece, and the only circular parts are these domes. But it is a holy shrine for the Muslims. This is from Lebanon. It's Notre Dame de la Victoire Monastery, and it is a relatively new monastery. There are probably 50 or 60, the Lebanese call this a monastery. It's, however, a seminary. And there are probably 40 or 50 seminarians that are studying here in this monastery complex. And as you can see here is the cloister walk going from the church into the monastery. It has this very ancient and series of columns. This is a very heavy sort of construction for the ceiling, and it creates this rather holy space looking out on the rest of the monastery. Lebanon and these particular, the many shrines that they have, or churches, it's a very Christian country, or it was a very Christian country until the really until the Americans came, and during the time of Nixon, when we shelled and bombed much of Beirut and the area, and that act really brought in many people from surrounding countries, and that became the Hezbollah movement to a large degree, because these were poor people, the Arabs, and the Christians were relatively well off, and that creates a great deal of tension. During the time when Syria controlled the country, this was maybe, 10 years ago? During that time, the influx of Islamic people was very great, and so the balance was changed from a Christian country into a more difficult country. Always just at the brink of war. Now I'm going to take you to another place along the pilgrimage, and this is Aleppo. This is the Church of St. George, as it was when I was there. And this is the interior of St. George after the terrible bombing, and where much of the outer structure was damaged, and the inner structure, because of the tremendous amount of shelling, the interiors of many of these buildings simply were collapsing. This is a mosque and a church in Aleppo. This particular church, or mosque, all of a sudden becomes this, as Aleppo is part of what I would call in French, le martyr. It has been just simply devastated by the forces, either, for mostly from the Assad regime. These are the walls from the fortress of Aleppo, and as you can see, this is a pre-war. This is the way I saw it, with these walls and the gates that go up. It's really a marvelous piece of architecture as a fortress. And so I thought that it would be important to create a piece like this. Much of this area here has been destroyed through the shelling and bombing. There we have another picture of it. This is the very center of Aleppo. We're still in Aleppo, and this is the new Armenian church. As I travel and paint, I meet all kinds of wonderful, wonderful people. And from this particular, as I was sitting on a corner here, and there were all kinds of stores, little places, restaurants, etc. And so it was a very, very hot day, and I was sketching, doing drawings, and this very nice woman and her family all came out and brought me chairs, brought me a chair and some water, which is one of the basic points of hospitality. And they were very kind, even though we didn't speak a common language. So this goes into the quarter where this church once was. It was quite destroyed. I want to speak about the monastery of St. Moses the Abyssinian. This is a place that is on the UNESCO World Heritage Site. This monastery is, and I hope I have a picture, here you have it here. This is the monastery here, and the church is within this fortress complex. This is the guest house. Now, to get up there, you have to walk really a couple thousand steps up a rather steep goat path, and then you're up at the top. And then you can see the interior of this place, 11th and 12th century frescoes. The person that is here is the founder. This is Father Paolo Daulio, an Italian who refounded this monastery in the late 80s and has gathered a community around him. He's been missing for 3 years. He was abducted and presumed now dead, but the monastery was ransacked by a group of perhaps 20 fighters, and but nobody was hurt. They only were looking for arms and for money. So this place stands, and it stands to the ecumenical work that Father Paolo had arranged between the Muslim people in the area and the Christians, a much needed dialogue in Syria. I wanted to point out that not only these monasteries were always so often away in from all types of civilization. And this is in Palestine, and this is the monastery of Marsaba. Again, a very famous Greek Orthodox monastery, and you can see and they have a number of people that live there, quite a number. In fact, it's a large monastery. Damascus. I did a number of paintings on Damascus, but I'm only showing this one because it's because you're all falling asleep, and I thought this would be enough on Damascus. Well, this place has also been largely destroyed. This is the entry to the main. It's the Roman remains entering into what was a forum, and is now the entry into the great marketplace, one of the largest that I've ever seen, called a souk. And the walls of the city are very much like this, with housing up above, and you could easily see St. Paul being lowered down, afraid of going out the regular gates. There's the presence of Christians in Syria under the Assad regime was very high. They were protected, and the Christians supported the Assad government. And this is one of the reasons why there is retribution against Christians. The Assad regime, for all of its faults, recognized a plurality, and is quite a different scene than what is taking place with ISIS and with other rebel groups that come in. And so many of the Christians have had to immigrate. This is Nazareth. I'm going into Israel now. And with Nazareth, they get a rug, and they also, you can see the contemporary Basilica of Mary. And in tribute, I created a nice little dove there. But the dove actually is from his baptism, but since he was a young child, I presume that the baptism took place here as a child. The story is slightly different than you'd find in the scriptures, but I feel that I have an insight. Anyway, so, and these are hotels where my group stayed. This happens to be about a mile above this, but I thought it would be good to make reference to the lovely accommodations that I stayed in. You see, all of this is very holy and contributes to the authenticity of my new Bible that I'm writing. Here is the church on the Mount of Beatitudes, a great structure that overlooks the Sea of Galilee and has a very, very peaceful garden in it with all of the Beatitudes around as kind of a grotto type effect. A very holy place, because this is up on a high hill overlooking that lake. You can imagine people easily walking up there from Capernaum or from Tabqa and visiting with Jesus. Jesus had a very difficult time in Bethlehem birthing. And so in this church, I gave it a rug, and it's also split so that you can see the entry into the basilica and also its apse on the other side. So you get kind of this full vision view of the Bethlehem center. Very important. It was not a cesarean, but this is a somewhat of a rupture, even though there was no rupture in the birth. That's accurate, isn't it? Yes. Thank you. So anyway, so you see this wonderful basilica. The basilica has this teeny little door that I like to point out. This door saved this basilica in the 600s from being destroyed by the Persians. And when they came here, they saw over the door the three magi dressed as Persians. And so, because they felt this was kind of their territory, they saved this particular building, whereas the buildings of the Holy Sepulchre and other places throughout the country were destroyed. And Jerusalem. Here are the walls of Suleiman the Magnificent. Wouldn't you love that name? Just the Magnificent, you know. That would be great. Abbot John the Magnificent. It has a ring to it, doesn't it? It does. I think that as the community grows, they may see this as a new honorium for him. So within the walls you have, of course, the Temple Mount with, in front of where I was standing on a terrace, this particular minaret was there. It's not on the Temple Mount. But this piece kind of encapsulates the Muslim part of this world. And here is Jerusalem again, but again from having given it a oriental rug, so we know where we're at, and then the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here, and also with the Temple Mount. And this is just a different extension of the walls, different interpretation. This particular building, the terrace I was on, was part of the Our Lady of Zion monastery for women. And these women they are in charge of the fourth station, Ecce Homo, third station. And so this is the dome coming up from the terrace where they live. And this view, of course, is exaggerated, but you do have a view of Jerusalem from up there. So when you leave Israel, you go into the Sinai desert, and here is the monastery of St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's Monastery is one of the oldest monasteries in the world, founded in the 300s by St. Helena, mother of Constantine, identifying this as the place of the burning bush, which is just behind the chapel, and also this is right next to the mountain of Sinai. As you can see here, this monastery is snugly fitted into this valley, and then you would go up around these mountains to the mountain of Sinai behind it. Again, a very holy place, I believe. They house one of the finest libraries and collections of icons in the world. Outside of the Vatican, they probably have the finest collection of icons. They also have this church, and the church here dates to Emperor Justinian's period. The walls are about the same and are obviously very protective, because this little door at the bottom, it was not there originally. The entry was through this little door and gate and pulley that where you would call down to whoever it was and find out who they were, friend or foe, and then they would release a basket for them to go back into the monastery. This monastery has never been destroyed. It has a document, a very precious document, from Muhammad. As they went through, Muhammad put his hand on this document, signing it that way, giving permission for this whole protectorate, the whole peninsula, to be a protected part of this monastery. They saved it partially because there is a mosque inside the monastery walls. And so that little architectural piece keeps most things quite quiet in the area. However, it is now closed, no longer can go there because of really terrible extremists in the Sinai Peninsula. And so the monastery continues, but there are no longer any guests coming in. Cairo, Al-Azhar Mosque. This is right across from the Khan Khalili market area. And this particular minaret and that mosque are the oldest in Cairo, dating to the early 700s. The others are more recent, probably dating to the 1200s. That's one of the Arabic schools for teaching the Quran. And here is my rendition. I didn't give them a full rug. They only get a partial. But you can see the use of these minarets here in this my construction. So then it's really a problem when you have these minarets sticking up all over the place. You'd have to do something with them so that you don't have, utter penis things going on. And so, because these are truly masculine. These, however, tend to be very feminine. And I don't know what the rest of this is, but I like to identify various genders. I think it's healthy. Synagogue and hanging church. What's left of this here is what I painted, and this is what's left. This was destroyed after the beginning of the revolution several years ago, and the last year, there were riots in the Coptic quarter where that ancient synagogue is. It probably predates Christianity, and the church there, the hanging church, from that probably also dates into the period maybe around the 300s, 400s. Unfortunately, there were also many people killed here. The massacres that have taken place throughout the Arab world have been just absolutely horrifying. And so we have this wonderful structure in Cairo, the Mosque of Muhammad Ali, not the boxer. And even though it might look like there are jabs of fist coming up here. It is not. This is one of the largest mosques in Cairo. It is the largest mosque in Cairo, and it is a real fortress, because it is sitting on a fortress. Fortress also of faith for the Muslim Islamic people. And that's it. Thank you. I didn't say I was done. I didn't say I was done yet. I mean, I know you're anxious. What time is it? It's perfect. It's right on the hour. May I just say a few extra words? Would anybody object? Well, that's too bad. I want to tell you that these pieces are only a small fraction of the whole collection. These paintings, drawings are in the thousands, and I know that the abbot is anxious to see me die so that they can sell them at a better price, at least. But nobody's going to say that out loud, I just suspect. But anyway, the collection is very, very large, and at this point in my life, I am truly proud of this work that I think, especially as a whole, taken, has a very deeply spiritual mark to it, a mark coming from a lifelong journey of painting and of this sort of discovery of many new worlds. And I hope in the future that I will be able to discover a few more. I would love to go to Iran, for example. Iran has some very fascinating, beautiful shrines that are waiting for special color, which I could provide. And so also the Buddhist world. I'm afraid of snakes, so there are some places I prefer not to go. That would be places where they put snakes on you when you're walking through markets and stuff like that, or they're eating them. Somehow that turns me off. Also, it wouldn't be good food for Buster either, would it? I didn't mention him yet. He's a provider of great resource of inspiration. And anyway, thank you. Nice talking with you. I had to say all of that, so thank you. Yes. Oh, okay, I can take questions.
There are 3 mics there, and here. So if you have a question or observation, please feel free to do so.
And I won't mock you if your question is bad.
Jerome,
Actually,
perhaps you could
I
say.
thought that was funnier than that, and
they
the
let it
response was-
slide right
They did,
by up
yeah,
into the
yeah.
stands.
So hot, yeah.
Jerome, what would you say? Two questions. What has been? Where do you find the most challenging moments when you're working on a series like this, and what have been some of your most satisfying moments as an artist?
Mm-hmm. Well, while I was in Italy, I recall painting in Siena. I was dutifully going off and doing the whole piazza there, and there was a little child there with his family, and so he moved over and kind of sat by me and was looking at my work, and then he started drawing, and so we had this kind of nonverbal conversation all through the drawing, and afterwards, his parents came up and we were talking, and they were part of a pilgrimage group. And this little guy especially was anxious. They had to leave very quickly. He was anxious to go to church. He wanted to go and see the Mass. And I met them again in the evening, right near the place where St. Catherine is, and that conversation continued. And it was inspiring because this little guy was just the most joyful, peaceful little kid I've ever met in my life. So that was a wonderful moment. Another one was in San Gimignano. I was drawing, and it was Sunday, and this very old woman comes up to me, and she says, I was sitting on the ground in front of the church, looking like, a regular hobo painter, and she comes up to me and she says, it's time for Mass. And the bells were ringing, and I thought, lady, I'm a priest. You don't have to tell me. This is what I was thinking. I know when it's time for Mass or not. Anyway, so she said, you're going to really enjoy it. It's just very, very nice. And so she goes up, and she literally disappeared. Of course, I trudged up. Italian liturgies are really not that good. And so if I can think of a reason why I would avoid it, I would. But she got me off my duff, and I went to church, and indeed, it was quite nice. The priest wasn't so good. But the rest of it was in this marvelous church where they made the movie of Tea with Mussolini. Have you seen the movie? Oh, you should see it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful film. Anyway, she got me to go to church. Any questions?
I was just going to ask, thinking about the title of this discussion, your monastic vocation, your artistic vocation, just thinking about how does the creative expression touch your monastic life, like your spiritual progress, and especially as a lot of what you showed us tonight were places, and so thinking of your monastic vocation, especially in stability and the particularity of this place, and so if you could kind of unpack how the physical, actual act of painting connects to when you're sitting there saying the Psalms or serving as a priest.
Sure. Yeah. I have a special pass for stability, and it is on it changed from Northwest to Delta. Okay. All kidding aside, that's my abbot's thought, but all of the years, I suppose, while I was off with students living in various countries and various situations, all of that was inspirational in the sense that having that relationship with young people and having to somehow inspire them to look more deeply at their past, at their history, and the history of the church, was also a time of reflection for myself. Many of the places that I lived were either other monasteries or religious houses. So, for example, while I was in Aix-en-Provence, I was a deacon, and so I was deacon there for the Archbishop of Aix-en-Provence, acting as a minister at that time. For the 25 years previous, while I was a brother, I was drawn through much of that relationship with France into a deeper understanding of monasticism because of the as a brother, we had a whole different introduction to monastic life. And so all of a sudden, being abroad and studying with masters of George Bernanos, I don't know if you're familiar with him, doing my master's degree and then the doctoral thesis on Bernanos, that led also to a journey of discovery of a spirituality, a French spirituality. With monasticism, the regularity here was, I think, that discipline probably was one of the most important parts of my growing up. I came here when I was 21, and so, I was just, barely out of the cradle. So in those days, I think that the age of maturity was different than it is today. But came here, and I needed the discipline of the monastery. The monastery offered so many exciting things. I mean, it was that had just completed the Abbey Church. The discussions were all about theology and the new ideas coming from the Vatican Council. The brothers' recreation rooms were filled with talk of what was happening in the church. And that was, for myself, a real education, kind of an opening up of this great wonder, which is the monastic tradition and the Roman Catholic Church. With traveling so much, I guess that I am in awe. I think of being in the Damascus Mosque, where St. John the Baptist's head is, one of his 3 heads is kept. And, well, they're all real too, So anyway, a Muslim man was teaching his son to pray. And so they were kneeling, and so the boy was there, and then he was putting his hands like this, and then they would go like this, and then they would bow down to the ground, and the little kid was all looking at his dad, and it was just a wonderful moment of seeing faith being passed on. Those times are, and being up, for example, at Marmusa with Father Paulo, I recall sitting in a chapel which was certainly not as large as this, the one that I showed you with all of the frescoes, for example. We had Mass, and there were carpets all over the floor. There are no chairs. And so you sit on the floor and lean, hopefully, against a wall or some sort of a pillar. And as we were praying in a Syriac type of liturgy, Roman Catholic Syriac, but I was looking at the young monks that were around the walls, and then I looked up at the frescoes, and I swear to God, they were all portraits of these people. It was just the same look and the same headgear that they wear. And it was just startling. It was this relationship of of where time seemed to collapse into one continuum. The journey, one never knows where that journey is going. And that's, I think, especially maybe, but it certainly is in monastic life. The journey that you begin with oftentimes has various turns. Some of it brought about by devotion, some of it brought about by the communal life, and some of it through sin itself. As we become more aware of sin in our lives, we also see that each of those moments are probably the greatest moments of grace. So that in this journey, one is always finding new and perhaps more relevant times of prayer, of peace in one's life. What this has led me to is that my poor parish in St. Joe is suffering through a series of homilies that is dealing oftentimes with war and our search for peace. And I think this is just the most important religious thing that is happening. And that a lot of that in my awareness simply comes through the experience of many of those countries and the really wonderful people that I meet or have met. And I reflect on that. That is part of the monastic me.
Jerome, thank you very much.
Oh, God.
Okay.
Just
Let's give
cutting
Jerome
me
a
off.
round of
Just
applause.
getting
Thank you.
hot. Thank you.